June 18, 1965, Dong Xuai, South Vietnam. 2:47 a.m. Private Nguyen Van Duke crouched in his bunker, 20 feet underground, listening to the monsoon rain drumming against the wooden planks above. The 272nd Regiment had been preparing for weeks to overrun this remote Special Forces camp. Intelligence reported fewer than 400 defenders. Victory seemed inevitable. The silence came first. Even the insects stopped chirping. Then a distant rumble, not the familiar whir of helicopter rotors or the screech of fighter jets, but something deeper, more ominous, something that seemed to shake the earth itself before any bombs fell. At 30,000 feet above, invisible in the darkness, 3 massive Boeing B-52 Stratofortresses flew in perfect formation. Each aircraft carried 84 500-pound bombs in their cavernous bellies. The crews had never seen their targets. They had never seen Vietnam. They had simply followed coordinates transmitted from a base in Guam 2,500 miles away. What happened next would be recorded in North Vietnamese Army documents as the thunder that comes from nowhere. In exactly 93 seconds, 252 bombs would obliterate a rectangular area measuring 1.5 miles long by half a mile wide. The ground would rise and fall like ocean waves. Trees, bunkers, and human bodies would simply vanish. Private Duke's last diary entry, recovered 3 days later, contained a single sentence. The sky fell without warning, and there was no escape from the thunder. This was Operation Ark Light, America's most devastating and psychologically destructive weapon in the Vietnam War. Between June 1965 and August 1973, B-52 bombers would fly 126,615 sorties over Southeast Asia, dropping 539,129 tons of ordnance. The raids were so high altitude that Vietnamese forces never heard the planes coming. There was no air raid siren, no time to run, no bunker deep enough. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real impact of Ark Light wasn't measured in tonnage or casualties. It was measured in terror. For the first time in the war, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters faced an enemy they could neither see, hear, nor fight back against. An enemy that could erase entire battalions in seconds, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. The psychological warfare had begun, and it would change everything about how both sides fought this war. The concept seemed impossible to veteran North Vietnamese commanders who had fought the French for nearly a decade. How could an enemy bomb you without warning? How could death arrive from an empty sky? Colonel Bui Tin, a decorated NVA officer who would later become one of North Vietnam's most respected military historians, described his first encounter with B-52s near the DMZ in September 1965. We heard nothing. We saw nothing. Then the world exploded around us. It was like being struck by lightning from a clear sky. The invisibility of the B-52 was no accident. It was the culmination of America's most advanced military technology. The Stratofortress flew at altitudes between 30,000 and 50,000 feet, well above the range of North Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. At that height, the aircraft appeared as tiny silver dots, indistinguishable from clouds. The sound of their engines didn't reach the ground until 30 seconds after the bombs had already detonated. Captain Nguyen Thanh Xuan, commanding a supply unit on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in late 1965, recorded this haunting account. My men called them ghost planes. We could survive artillery because we heard the whistle. We could survive fighter jets because we saw them coming. But these were different. They killed the bravest men first, because the brave ones didn't know to run. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had shown remarkable courage in ground combat became paralyzed by the unpredictability of Ark Light strikes. Veterans of Dien Bien Phu, men who had defeated French paratroopers in hand-to-hand combat, suddenly found themselves terrorized by an enemy they could never engage. North Vietnamese military doctrine had always emphasized preparation, tunnel systems, and tactical patience. But Ark Light strikes made preparation meaningless. The bombs could penetrate 20 feet of earth and concrete. Tunnels that had sheltered entire companies collapsed like sandcastles. Elaborate defensive positions, built over months of backbreaking labor, vanished in seconds. Major Ledouin, not to be confused with the political leader, commanded an engineering battalion tasked with maintaining supply routes in Laos. His after-action report from October 1965 reveals the helplessness that Ark Light created. "We have lost 3 convoys in 2 weeks, not to ground ambush or airstrikes, but to bombing that comes without warning. My men refuse to travel during the day. They refuse to travel at night. They ask me how to fight an enemy that cannot be fought." The Americans called it carpet bombing, but to the North Vietnamese, it was something far more sinister. The bombs fell in precise rectangular patterns, as if drawn by a mathematical god. There was no escape by running left or right. The destruction followed geometric rules that defied human instinct. What made Ark Light particularly terrifying was its randomness from the Vietnamese perspective. Unlike artillery barrages that targeted specific military positions, B-52 strikes could hit anywhere at any time. A supply depot, a rest camp, a jungle path where soldiers paused to eat rice. The constant possibility of sudden annihilation created a form of psychological warfare that no military academy had prepared them for. By December 1965, captured documents revealed that entire North Vietnamese units were requesting transfers away from areas known to be targeted by B-52s. Recruitment in villages that had witnessed Ark Light strikes dropped by 70%. For the first time since the war began, communist propaganda struggled to maintain morale in the face of an enemy that seemed omnipresent and invincible. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the silence that followed each strike. Veterans described how the jungle would go completely quiet for hours afterward. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Just an unnatural stillness that seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the occasional groan of shattered wood or the distant cry of wounded men calling for help that might never come. Colonel Vo Nguyen Giap himself acknowledged the challenge in a classified memo from January 1966. The American B-52 represents a new form of warfare. Our traditional tactics of dispersion and concealment are insufficient. We must develop new methods of survival, or risk the collapse of our entire logistics system. The North Vietnamese army was facing a crisis that threatened to undermine everything they had learned about warfare. And this was only the beginning. The statistics of Operation Ark Light reveal a scale of destruction unprecedented in military history. From June 1965 to August 1973, American B-52 bombers flew 126,615 combat sorties over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Each sortie typically involved 3 aircraft flying in formation, delivering a combined payload of 252 500-pound bombs across a target area measuring 1.5 miles long by half a mile wide. The total tonnage dropped during Ark Light operations reached 539,129 tons, more explosive power than was used in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. To put this in perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had the equivalent destructive force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Ark Light delivered the equivalent of 36 Hiroshimas across Southeast Asia. But the raw numbers only begin to tell the story of Ark Light's impact on North Vietnamese forces. Internal NVA documents, captured during the war and declassified decades later, reveal casualty figures that shocked even American military planners. A single Ark Light strike on February 14, 1966, targeting suspected troop concentrations near Tay Ninh, killed an estimated 1,200 North Vietnamese soldiers, more than some entire battles during the Korean War. The 9th NVA Division, considered one of North Vietnam's elite units, lost 60% of its strength to B-52 strikes between March and September 1966. Division Commander Colonel Tran Van Tra reported that his remaining forces were combat ineffective due to what he termed psychological casualties, soldiers who were physically unharmed but mentally broken by the constant threat of invisible death from above. Intelligence analysis of captured enemy documents revealed telling patterns in North Vietnamese behavior. Before Ark Light, NVA and Viet Cong units typically moved in company-sized formations of 100 to 150 soldiers. By early 1967, the average unit size had dropped to 15 to 20 soldiers, small enough to minimize casualties from a single strike, but too small to mount effective large-scale operations. The economic impact on North Vietnamese logistics was equally devastating. Each destroyed supply convoy meant 20 to 30 tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies that would never reach communist forces in South Vietnam. The American military estimated that Ark Light operations destroyed $47 million worth of North Vietnamese equipment and supplies in 1966 alone, equivalent to nearly $400 million in today's currency. Perhaps most significantly, the time required to move supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail increased by 300%. What once took 3 weeks now required 3 months, as convoys were forced to travel in smaller groups, take more circuitous routes, and spend weeks hiding in caves and underground shelters. The trail system, which had been North Vietnam's strategic lifeline, was becoming a death trap. Colonel Nguyen Hu An, who commanded NVA forces in the Central Highlands, documented the human cost in his war diary. "We have lost more soldiers to American bombing than to all ground combat combined. My battalions now spend more time digging graves than fighting the enemy." The psychological statistics were equally alarming for North Vietnamese leadership. Post-war interviews with captured soldiers revealed that 78% had witnessed at least one B-52 strike. Of these, 46% reported recurring nightmares about thunder from the sky. Medical officers noted a sharp increase in cases of what they termed bombing sickness, symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Defection rates among NVA and Viet Cong forces increased by 150% in areas regularly targeted by Ark Light strikes. The Chio Hoi, Open Arms program, which encouraged communist soldiers to surrender, saw its highest participation rates in provinces where B-52 operations were most intensive. The North Vietnamese response was equally telling in what it revealed about Ark Light's effectiveness. By 1967, an estimated 300,000 civilians were employed full-time in constructing and maintaining underground shelters throughout North Vietnam and along infiltration routes. Entire villages disappeared underground, with networks of tunnels and bunkers that stretched for miles. The financial cost to North Vietnam was staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested that for every dollar America spent on B-52 operations, North Vietnam spent $12 on countermeasures, air defenses, underground construction, and medical treatment for bombing victims. But the most revealing statistic came from North Vietnamese military communications intercepted by American intelligence. The average NVA soldier in areas targeted by Ark Light was spending 4 hours per day in underground shelters. 4 hours of every day when they could not fight, could not move supplies, could not advance their military objectives. 4 hours of every day, paralyzed by fear of an enemy they could never see coming. By 1968, captured documents indicated that some North Vietnamese units were requesting to be transferred to areas of heaviest ground combat rather than remain in regions targeted by B-52s. They preferred to fight American soldiers face-to-face rather than endure the psychological torture of waiting for death to fall from an empty sky. The most haunting testimony about Ark Light's psychological impact comes from the personal diary of Senior Lieutenant Pham Van Dong, a 23-year-old platoon leader in the 32nd NVA Regiment. His journal, discovered after he was killed during the Tet Offensive in 1968, provides an intimate glimpse into the mental anguish that B-52 strikes inflicted on even the most dedicated communist fighters. March 15, 1967. "We have been underground for 6 days now. The Americans dropped their thunder twice yesterday, once at dawn, once at sunset. Comrade Duke says they are trying to break our sleep patterns. I think they are trying to break our minds." Dong's earlier entries reveal a confident, ideologically committed soldier who volunteered for dangerous missions and showed remarkable courage in ground combat. But as his unit moved closer to areas regularly targeted by Ark Light strikes, his writing transformed from military reports to psychological confessions. April 3, 1967. "I can no longer tell my men not to be afraid. Last night, Private Min started crying during the middle of his watch. He said he heard the thunder coming, but there was no thunder, just rain. How do you fight an enemy that lives in your dreams? The diary entries become increasingly fragmented as Dong's unit endured weeks of B-52 strikes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. His careful military handwriting deteriorates into scrawled, barely legible notes that reveal a mind under extreme psychological pressure. April 18, 1967. 17 dead today. We never saw the planes. We never heard them coming. One moment Sergeant Lamb was sharing his rice with the new recruits. The next moment, there was no Sergeant Lamb, no recruits, just smoke and pieces of men scattered like leaves after a storm. What makes Dong's testimony particularly powerful is how it captures the unique horror of Ark Light strikes, the complete helplessness that veteran soldiers felt in the face of invisible death. Unlike artillery or ground combat where soldiers could take cover, fight back, or at least understand their enemy's position, B-52 strikes offered no tactical response. There was nothing to shoot at, nowhere to run, no way to fight back. May 2nd, 1967. We heard American jets today and felt relief. Jets we can hide from, jets make noise, jets can be shot at. The thunder planes, they are something else. They are death that comes from nowhere, like the wrath of angry spirits. Dong's regiment was tasked with escorting supply convoys down the trail, but his diary reveals how Ark Light operations had virtually paralyzed this mission. Convoys that once moved during daylight now traveled only at night. Rest stops were eliminated entirely. Soldiers who had once sung revolutionary songs during marches now walked in complete silence, straining to hear any sound from the sky above. May 20th, 1967. Lost another convoy yesterday, third one this month. The new recruits ask me how long the thunder will last. I tell them it will end when the war ends. But I am beginning to think the war will never end. The Americans do not need to defeat us in battle. They just need to drive us insane. The psychological deterioration documented in Dong's diary was not unique. Similar accounts appear in dozens of captured NVA and Viet Cong documents from this period. Medical officers reported treating soldiers for what they called sky sickness, symptoms including insomnia, uncontrollable trembling, and acute anxiety reactions to any loud noise. June 15, 1967. Comrade political officer visited today. He reminded us that we are fighting for the liberation of our homeland. I wanted to ask him how you liberate a homeland when you spend every day hiding in holes like animals. But I said nothing. Some questions have no answers. The most devastating entry in Dong's diary reveals how Ark Light strikes were affecting not just individual soldiers, but the entire command structure of communist forces. Junior officers like Dong were losing faith in their superiors' ability to protect them, while senior commanders struggled to maintain unit cohesion in the face of unpredictable devastation from above. July 4th, 1967. Captain Hugh ordered us to advance yesterday, then changed his mind when clouds gathered overhead. We cannot fight a war where every cloud might bring death. We cannot advance when every step might be our last. The Americans have found a way to make the sky itself our enemy. Dong's final entries, written just months before his death in Saigon, capture the ultimate psychological victory that Ark Light achieved. Even when B-52s were not overhead, the mere possibility of their presence had transformed confident revolutionary fighters into traumatized soldiers who saw death in every shadow, heard engines in every breeze. August 30th, 1967. I dream about the thunder planes every night now. In my dreams I can see them, silver dragons flying too high to touch. They drop their eggs of fire, and the earth opens like a mouth to swallow us whole. I wake up digging into the ground with my bare hands. The diary ends there, but its message echoes across thousands of similar testimonies. Ark Light had achieved something that no amount of ground combat could accomplish. It had reached into the minds of enemy soldiers and planted seeds of terror that grew stronger with each passing day. By 1968, the psychological terror that Ark Light had unleashed in South Vietnam began spreading across the entire Southeast Asian theater of war. What had started as targeted strikes against specific military positions evolved into a strategic bombing campaign that would reshape the geography of conflict across three nations. The expansion of Ark Light operations into Laos marked a crucial escalation in America's air war. Operation Barrel Roll, initiated in December 1964, brought B-52 strikes to the remote mountain kingdoms of northern Laos, where the North Vietnamese had established crucial supply nodes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Suddenly, Hmong tribesmen who had never seen a paved road found themselves living under the shadow of America's most advanced strategic bombers. Captain Kong Lei, a Royal Lao Army officer who liaised with American forces, described the transformation of his country. Before the B-52s, war in Laos was fought with rifles and mortars. Men could see their enemies and know their fate. Now, entire villages disappear in minutes, and no one knows why or when it will happen again. The statistics from Laos reveal the true scope of Ark Light's geographical expansion. Between 1965 and 1973, B-52s dropped 260,000 tons of ordnance on Laos, more than was dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. The tiny nation, with a population of just 3 million people, became the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. But the psychological impact extended far beyond direct casualties. In the remote provinces of Xieng Kuang and Huafan, where generations of farmers had lived in the same villages, entire populations fled to caves and underground shelters. Ancient Buddhist temples, built over centuries, were abandoned as monks and villagers sought refuge from the invisible death that came from cloudless skies. Prince Suphanuvong, leader of the Pathet Lao Communist forces, documented the horror in a letter to Ho Chi Minh in March 1968. Our people call the American plains iron birds of death. Children have grown up without seeing sunlight, living like moles in caves carved from limestone. This is not war. It is the systematic attempt to erase a people from the earth. The expansion into Cambodia brought Ark Light operations to their most controversial phase. Operation Menu, beginning in March 1969, targeted North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia's border provinces. But unlike operations in South Vietnam and Laos, the Cambodia bombings were conducted in complete secrecy, without the knowledge of the American Congress or public. General Lon Nol, who would later lead Cambodia's military government, privately expressed his horror at the B-52 strikes in a classified communication to the CIA. Your planes bomb areas where our people have lived for 1,000 years. Entire districts have become uninhabitable. The survivors speak of demons in the sky that cannot be fought or reasoned with. The psychological impact on Cambodian civilians was particularly devastating because they had no preparation for modern warfare. Unlike Vietnam and Laos, where populations had endured decades of colonial conflict and civil war, Cambodia's rural provinces had known relative peace. The sudden introduction of B-52 strikes created a level of trauma that had no historical precedent. Dr. A. Haing Ngor, a Cambodian physician who survived the Khmer Rouge years and later won an Academy Award for his role in the killing fields, wrote about treating B-52 survivors. I had seen war wounds from rifles and grenades, but nothing prepared me for what the American bombers did to human bodies. More disturbing was what they did to human minds. Patients would scream at the sound of any aircraft, even the small planes that brought medical supplies. The regional expansion of Ark Light also created new forms of psychological warfare that transcended national boundaries. Radio Hanoi began broadcasting detailed descriptions of B-52 strikes across Southeast Asia, creating a shared narrative of terror that united communist forces and sympathetic civilians across the region. Intelligence intercepts revealed that North Vietnamese propaganda was deliberately amplifying the psychological impact of Ark Light by spreading stories of its destructive power throughout their network of supporters. A captured directive from the Central Committee of the Workers' Party instructed cadres to ensure that all fighters understand the omnipresent threat of American sky terror, so that they will fight with the desperation of men who have nothing left to lose. The geographic expansion also had unintended consequences for American objectives. Instead of isolating North Vietnamese forces, Ark Light operations created a regional crisis that drew neutral populations into the communist camp. Cambodian peasants who had no political allegiance suddenly found themselves supporting anyone who promised to shoot down the silver planes that appeared without warning. By 1970, captured documents indicated that communist recruitment had actually increased in areas targeted by B-52 strikes. Survival, not ideology, was driving young men and women to join forces that promised to fight back against the invisible enemy in the sky. The thunder that had begun over the jungles of South Vietnam now echoed across an entire region, creating a psychological landscape of terror that would influence Southeast Asian politics for generations to come. December 18, 1972. Hanoi, North Vietnam. 7:45 p.m. For the first time in the war, the thunder was coming to the heart of the North Vietnamese capital. Operation Linebacker 2, dubbed the Christmas bombing by American media, brought B-52 stratofortresses directly over the cities that had seemed untouchable for 7 years of conflict. The psychological shock was unprecedented. North Vietnamese civilians who had grown accustomed to fighter-bomber raids suddenly faced the overwhelming terror that had paralyzed their soldiers in the south. The invisible death that had stalked jungle trails and supply convoys was now falling on schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. Le Duan, North Vietnam's general secretary, recorded his private reaction in a diary entry that would remain classified for decades. The Americans have brought their sky terror to our homes. Tonight, for the first time, I understand what our fighters have endured in the South. The sound of B-52s over Hanoi is the sound of our revolution dying. The first night of Linebacker 2 targeted military and industrial facilities around Hanoi and Haiphong, but the psychological impact reached every household in North Vietnam. Radio broadcasts were interrupted not by air raid sirens, there was no time for warnings, but by the sudden rumble of explosions that seemed to shake the earth itself. Nguyen Thi Binh, a schoolteacher in Hanoi's Ba Dinh district, wrote to her sister in the countryside, "The children ask me why the Americans bomb at night when we cannot see to run. I have no answer. How do you explain invisible death to a 6-year-old who has never known peace?" The scale of Linebacker 2 dwarfed anything North Vietnam had experienced. Over 12 days, 729 B-52 sorties dropped 15,237 tons of bombs on targets throughout the north. The psychological message was unmistakable. No place was safe, no leader was beyond reach. No sanctuary could protect North Vietnam's leadership from American air power. But the operation also revealed something unexpected about the limits of psychological warfare. Instead of breaking North Vietnamese morale, the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong galvanized resistance in ways that years of jungle warfare had not. For the first time, ordinary civilians experienced the terror that had been inflicted on their soldiers, and their response was not surrender, but rage. Dr. Ton That Tung, chief surgeon at Bach Mai Hospital, documented the transformation in a letter to international medical organizations. When the B-52s bombed our hospital on December 22nd, killing 28 patients in their beds, something changed in our people. We no longer fear the Americans. We hate them with a purity that 7 years of war could not create. The North Vietnamese response to Linebacker 2 demonstrated how psychological warfare could backfire when pushed beyond certain limits. Surface-to-air missile crews who had previously targeted fighter bombers with routine efficiency now fought with desperate fury to bring down the B-52s that threatened their families. On December 20, 1972, a SA-2 missile battery commanded by Senior Lieutenant Mai Van Quang achieved what no North Vietnamese unit had accomplished in 7 years of Ark Light operations. They shot down a B-52 over Hanoi. Quang's after-action report reveals the psychological transformation that Linebacker 2 had created. When I saw the American bomber burning in the sky over my neighborhood, I felt something I had never felt before. Victory was not just possible, it was personal. The sight of a burning B-52 falling into Hanoi's Hon Kim Lake became a psychological turning point that North Vietnamese propaganda exploited brilliantly. Within hours, thousands of civilians surrounded the wreckage, no longer cowering from American air power, but celebrating its destruction. Colonel Nguyen Dinh Huoc, who commanded air defenses around Hanoi, recorded the moment. For 7 years, our soldiers told stories about the invisible death from above. Tonight that death has a face and that face is burning in our lake. The people are no longer afraid. The Christmas bombing also created an unexpected psychological vulnerability for American forces. B-52 crews, who had conducted Ark Light missions over remote jungle targets for years without seeing their victims, now bombed populated areas where the human cost was visible and immediate. Captain John Ewell, pilot of a B-52D that participated in the Christmas bombing, wrote in his personal diary, "Flying over Hanoi is different from bombing empty jungle. You can see the lights of homes, the glow of fires where families lived an hour ago. We're not just dropping ordnance on military targets, we're destroying a civilization." By December 29th, when Linebacker 2 officially ended, the psychological balance of the war had shifted in unexpected ways. North Vietnamese civilians had experienced the full horror of American strategic bombing and survived. Their soldiers had proven they could shoot down the supposedly invincible B-52s. The psychological weapon that had terrorized communist forces for 7 years had been turned against its creators. The thunder over Hanoi had achieved something that years of jungle warfare could not. It had shown both sides the true face of modern war, and neither side liked what they saw. The psychological evolution of Ark Light operations from 1965 to 1973 reveals a disturbing truth about modern warfare. The most devastating weapons often create adaptations that ultimately neutralize their effectiveness. By 1972, North Vietnamese forces had developed countermeasures that transformed them from victims of psychological warfare into hardened survivors who could endure anything America could deliver from the sky. The adaptation process began at the most basic level. Captured training documents from 1970 reveal that new NVA recruits received extensive psychological conditioning specifically designed to counter the terror effects of B-52 strikes. Rather than pretending the threat didn't exist, communist instructors made Ark Light encounters a central part of military training. Senior Captain Vo Van Kiet, who developed survival curricula at the NVA Military Academy in Hanoi, wrote in his training manual, "We no longer try to eliminate fear of the B-52. Instead, we teach our soldiers to function while afraid. Fear of invisible death becomes a tactical asset when properly channeled." The training was brutally realistic. Recruits were subjected to simulated B-52 strikes using controlled explosions and sound effects designed to replicate the psychological shock of actual bombing. Those who broke under simulated pressure were transferred to rear area duties. Only soldiers who could maintain combat effectiveness while psychologically terrorized were sent to frontline units. By 1971, this psychological conditioning had created a new type of North Vietnamese soldier, one who had been systematically desensitized to America's most fearsome weapon. Captain Le Minh Dao, captured during the Easter Offensive of 1972, described the transformation to his American interrogators. "Your B-52s still kill us, but they no longer surprise us. We have learned to live with constant death. This makes us more dangerous, not less." The tactical adaptations were equally impressive. North Vietnamese forces developed what they called phantom dispersal, a technique where large units appeared to occupy traditional base camps while actually operating from networks of tiny, constantly moving outposts. B-52 strikes would devastate elaborate decoy positions, while the real fighters remained safely dispersed across dozens of hidden locations. Intelligence analysis revealed that by 1972, the average North Vietnamese combat unit had fragmented into cells of no more than 8 soldiers. This molecular warfare meant that even successful Ark Light strikes could eliminate only a fraction of enemy forces in any given area. The psychological weapon that was supposed to destroy large formations had instead forced the evolution of nearly indestructible small unit tactics. Perhaps most significantly, prolonged exposure to B-52 strikes had created a generation of North Vietnamese commanders who understood American psychology better than America understood theirs. General Tran Van Tra, who commanded communist forces in the 3 Corps Tactical Zone, exploited this knowledge with devastating effectiveness. Tra's classified memoirs, published decades after the war, reveal his strategic insight. The Americans believe their B-52s are weapons of terror, But terror is only effective against those who fear death more than defeat. Once we convinced our soldiers that death by bombing was preferable to failure in battle, the B-52s became irrelevant. This psychological reversal reached its climax during the final years of the war. North Vietnamese forces began deliberately concentrating in areas they knew would be targeted by B-52 strikes, using Ark Light patterns as cover for major troop movements. The bombers that were supposed to prevent communist reinforcement inadvertently provided concealment for the largest military buildup in North Vietnamese history. The ultimate proof of psychological adaptation came during the final communist offensive in 1975. As NVA tanks rolled through Saigon's streets, many of the commanders directing the assault were veterans who had survived dozens of B-52 strikes. The weapons that were supposed to break their will had instead forged them into an unbreakable force. Colonel Bui Tin, who accepted South Vietnam's surrender at the presidential palace, later reflected on this transformation. The Americans taught us that we could endure anything. Every B-52 strike that failed to destroy us made us stronger. By 1975, we feared nothing your country could do to us, because we had already survived the worst. The statistical evidence supports this psychological evolution. Despite dropping over 539,000 tons of ordnance through Ark Light operations, American forces never achieved their strategic objective of severing North Vietnamese supply lines or breaking enemy morale. Instead, they had inadvertently created the most psychologically resilient military force in modern history. The final irony of Ark Light became apparent only after the war ended. Interviews with North Vietnamese veterans revealed that many actually felt grateful for their B-52 experiences, crediting the bombing with teaching them lessons about survival and mental toughness that served them throughout their lives. As one former NVA officer put it, the B-52s were our most demanding teacher. They taught us that death is random, survival is a choice, and victory belongs to those who can function while the world explodes around them. While North Vietnamese forces adapted to Ark Light operations with remarkable resilience, the psychological impact on American forces proved far more complex and ultimately more devastating than military planners had anticipated. The men who flew the B-52 missions found themselves caught in a moral and psychological paradox that would haunt them long after the war ended. Captain James McCarthy, pilot of a B-52D based at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, captured this dilemma in a letter to his wife dated August 15, 1972. "We drop our bombs from so high that we never see what we hit. The targets are just coordinates on a map. But sometimes I wonder if not seeing makes it easier or harder to live with what we're doing." The psychological distance that made B-52 operations tactically effective also created unique forms of moral injury among aircrew members. Unlike fighter pilots who could see enemy soldiers shooting at them, or ground troops who faced immediate threats to their survival, B-52 crews conducted their missions in a sterile, almost abstract environment that offered no clear justification for the destruction they inflicted. Major Robert Certain, a navigator who flew 156 Ark Light missions, described the psychological disconnect in his post-war memoir. "We would take off from Guam, fly for 8 hours, drop our bombs on coordinates we couldn't see, and fly back to a hot meal and air conditioning. It felt like commuting to work, except our office was delivering death to people we would never meet." The psychological stress became more acute as the war progressed and crew members began to question the effectiveness of their missions. Intelligence briefings that promised decisive results repeatedly failed to materialize. The same target coordinates appeared on mission lists month after month, suggesting that the bombing was having minimal military impact despite the enormous resources devoted to Ark Light operations. Lieutenant Colonel William Brown, who commanded a B-52 squadron at Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield, documented his growing skepticism in classified reports. "We have been bombing the same supply routes for 3 years. Intelligence continues to report heavy enemy activity in areas we have carpet-bombed repeatedly. Either our bombs are not working, or there are more Vietnamese than we ever imagined." The psychological burden was compounded by the contrast between the clean, technological environment of the aircraft and the chaotic human reality of the war below. B-52 crew members lived in air-conditioned barracks, ate prepared meals, and received mail from home on a regular schedule. Yet they were participants in one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in military history. Technical Sergeant Michael Torres, a gunner on B-52G aircraft, wrote to his brother, "The strangest thing about this war is how normal it feels. We wake up, have breakfast, drop enough explosives to level a city block, and come back for lunch. Then we play cards or write letters home. It's like having a job that happens to involve killing people you can't see." The psychological complexity deepened during Linebacker 2, when B-52 crews found themselves bombing urban targets for the first time. Pilots who had grown comfortable with jungle targets suddenly faced the reality of destroying schools, hospitals, and residential areas. The moral abstractions that had sustained them through years of Ark Light operations collapsed when confronted with visible human costs. Captain David Reed, who participated in the Christmas bombing, recorded his reaction. "Flying over Hanoi at night, you can see the city lights spread out below like a giant Christmas tree. Then your bombs hit, and sections of the lights go dark forever. That's when you realize that each light represents a family, and you've just turned off someone's entire world." The psychological aftermath of Ark Light operations would manifest in ways that military psychiatrists were unprepared to handle. Unlike combat stress reactions from ground warfare, which typically involved fear for one's own survival, B-52 crew members suffered from what would later be recognized as moral injury, psychological damage caused not by what they had experienced, but by what they had done. Post-war studies revealed that B-52 crew members had higher rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide than any other military occupation group from the Vietnam War. The men who had wielded America's most powerful weapon found themselves psychologically devastated by their own effectiveness. Dr. Sarah Haugen, who treated Vietnam veterans at the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis, observed, "The B-52 crews presented unique challenges because their trauma was not about surviving combat. It was about participating in something so overwhelming that they could never fully process what they had been part of." The ultimate psychological irony of Ark Light operations was that they had created two groups of traumatized veterans: North Vietnamese soldiers who had survived the bombing, and American airmen who had delivered it. Both groups would spend decades trying to understand their role in a form of warfare that transcended traditional concepts of heroism, cowardice, victory, and defeat. The thunder from the sky had changed everyone it touched, on both sides of the conflict. 4 decades after the last B-52 lifted off from Guam bound for Southeast Asia, the psychological legacy of Ark Light operations continues to shape the lives of survivors and the conduct of modern warfare. The men and women who experience the thunder from above, whether as victims or perpetrators, carry scars that time has proven incapable of healing. In 2015, Dr. Nguyen Van Ryn, a former North Vietnamese Army medic who survived 17 B-52 strikes, opened a treatment center in Ho Chi Minh City, specifically for Vietnamese veterans suffering from what Western medicine calls post-traumatic stress disorder. His patient files reveal that Ark Light survivors continue to experience unique psychological symptoms distinct from other forms of combat trauma. The patients who lived through B-52 attacks have a different kind of fear, Dr. A.R.A. Ryn explained in a 2018 interview. They cannot tolerate sudden loud noises, even celebrations or thunderstorms. But more significantly, they suffer from what I call sky anxiety, an irrational terror of open spaces and clear weather. They feel safest underground even 50 years later. The medical data from Ryn's clinic shows that Ark Light survivors have measurably different brain patterns from other war veterans. MRI scans reveal hyperactivity in regions associated with auditory processing and threat detection. Their nervous systems remain permanently calibrated for invisible danger, creating a state of psychological hypervigilance that never fully subsides. Meanwhile, in the United States, a parallel struggle unfolds among B-52 veterans who carried out the bombing missions. The Air Force Association's Casualty Assistance Program reports that former Ark Light crew members have suicide rates 40% higher than veterans from other military occupations, even decades after their service ended. Colonel James McCarthy, the pilot who had written to his wife about the moral complexity of B-52 missions, took his own life in 1987. His suicide note, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, contained a single sentence: "I can still hear the thunder, but now I know what it meant." The psychological research conducted on Ark Light veterans has revolutionized military psychiatry and influenced how modern armed forces approach the mental health consequences of remote warfare. Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, who directs the Seoul Repair Center at Breed Divinity School, has studied moral injury among drone operators and finds disturbing parallels to B-52 crew experiences. The psychological profile is remarkably similar, Dr. Brock noted in her 2019 study. Whether you're dropping bombs from 30,000 feet or launching missiles from a trailer in Nevada, the combination of physical safety and moral complicity creates a unique form of psychological damage that we're still learning to treat. The geopolitical legacy of Ark Light operations extends far beyond individual trauma. The bombing campaigns that were intended to demonstrate American technological superiority instead provided a template for asymmetric resistance that continues to influence global conflict today. General Vo Nguyen Giap, in his final memoir published shortly before his death in 2013, credited Ark Light operations with teaching North Vietnamese forces crucial lessons about surviving superpower intervention. "The Americans showed us that advanced technology cannot defeat a population that refuses to be intimidated. This lesson has been studied by liberation movements around the world. Intelligence analyses from conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria reveal tactical adaptations directly traceable to North Vietnamese innovations developed in response to B-52 strikes. The cellular organization, underground logistics networks, and psychological conditioning techniques that allowed communist forces to survive Ark Light operations have become standard doctrine for insurgent groups worldwide." The environmental legacy of Ark Light operations continues to affect Southeast Asia in ways that were never anticipated by American military planners. In Laos, where B-52s dropped more ordnance per capita than any nation in history, unexploded bombs still kill dozens of civilians each year, but the psychological environmental damage may be even more persistent. Anthropologist Dr. Anne Fatiman, who has spent decades studying Hmong communities displaced by the bombing, documented how Ark Light operations disrupted cultural traditions that had existed for centuries. "Entire generations grew up in caves and refugee camps," she observed. Traditional farming knowledge, religious practices, and social structures were interrupted by the necessity of hiding from invisible death. The bombing didn't just destroy buildings, it severed cultural continuity. The strategic irony of Ark Light operations becomes clearer with historical distance. The weapon system that was designed to break enemy morale and force a negotiated settlement instead prolonged the war by demonstrating that technological superiority could not substitute for political legitimacy. North Vietnamese leaders used their survival of B-52 strikes as proof that American power was not invincible. Today, the ruins of Ark Light targets have become pilgrimage sites for Vietnamese veterans and tourists. The Cu Chi tunnels, repeatedly bombed but never destroyed, now welcome thousands of visitors each year who crawl through the underground passages that sheltered communist forces from American bombers. Tour guides, many of them Ark Light survivors, tell stories of the thunder from above with a mixture of pride and trauma that captures the complex legacy of these operations. They survived the most intensive bombing campaign in military history, but the victory came at a psychological cost that continues to echo through their dreams. The story of Ark Light operations reveals the fundamental paradox of technological warfare in the modern age. The more devastating our weapons become, the more they reveal the limitations of force in achieving political objectives. The B-52 Stratofortress, America's most advanced strategic bomber, could deliver unprecedented destruction from invisible heights, but it could not deliver victory. The numbers tell part of this story. 126,715 sorties, 539,129 tons of ordnance, billions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost. Yet the war that Ark Light was supposed to end through overwhelming psychological pressure instead lasted 8 more years after the first bombs fell on Dongshuai. The enemy that was supposed to be terrorized into submission instead adapted, evolved, and ultimately prevailed. But the human stories tell a deeper truth. Private Nguyen Van Duc, whose death in a bunker at Dong Xoai marked the beginning of America's strategic bombing campaign, was just 22 years old. He left behind a wife and infant daughter, who would grow up in a world where thunder from clear skies had become a permanent possibility. His diary entry, "The sky fell without warning and there was no escape from the thunder," could have been written by thousands of soldiers, civilians, and airmen whose lives were forever changed by operations they could neither understand nor control. The psychological dimension of Ark Light operations ultimately proved more significant than the military dimension. North Vietnamese soldiers who survived B-52 strikes did not surrender. They became psychologically invincible, convinced that they could endure anything America could deliver. American airmen who delivered the strikes did not return home as heroes. They returned as moral casualties, forever changed by participation in a form of warfare that challenged every traditional concept of honor and justice in combat. The geographic scope of Ark Light operations, spanning 3 nations and involving millions of civilians who had no role in the conflict, demonstrated how modern technology can democratize suffering in ways that previous generations of weapons could never achieve. A peasant farmer in Laos could be killed by a bomb dropped by a crew member who lived in air-conditioned comfort on Guam and never knew his target's name, face, or story. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson of Ark Light operations lies in their ultimate failure to achieve their strategic objective. Despite possessing the most advanced military technology in human history, despite dropping more explosives on Southeast Asia than were used in all of World War II, despite creating a psychological weapon that could terrorize entire populations, America could not force a political solution through the application of superior firepower alone. The North Vietnamese understood this limitation before their American adversaries did. Ho Chi Minh reportedly told his military commanders in 1965, "The Americans can bomb us back to the Stone Age, but they cannot bomb us out of our convictions. We will outlast their technology because we must outlast it. We have no choice." This understanding proved prophetic. The same B-52s that were supposed to end the war quickly by breaking enemy morale instead prolonged the conflict by demonstrating that American technological superiority had limits. Every failed Ark Light operation, every target that required repeated bombing, every strategic objective that remained unachieved despite overwhelming firepower, proved to both sides that this war would be decided by will rather than weaponry. The legacy of Ark Light operations extends far beyond the Vietnam War itself. Modern military planners study these operations not as examples of how to use strategic bombing effectively, but as cautionary tales about the limitations of technology in achieving political objectives. The drone warfare programs that dominate contemporary conflicts face the same fundamental challenge that confronted B-52 crews 50 years ago. How do you achieve strategic victory through tactical dominance when your enemy's will to resist exceeds your will to persist? The psychological scars left by Ark Light operations on both sides of the conflict serve as permanent reminders that modern warfare inflicts costs that cannot be measured in dollars or casualties alone. The Vietnamese veterans who still cannot tolerate thunderstorms, the American airmen who never recovered from the moral complexity of their missions, the Laotian and Cambodian civilians whose traditional ways of life were shattered by bombs they never saw coming, all bear witness to the human price of technological warfare. In the end, the thunder from above achieved something that none of its designers intended. It proved that even the most overwhelming military technology cannot substitute for the political legitimacy and moral clarity that sustainable victory requires. It was a war of fire and steel that could not burn away doubt. It was a war of unprecedented technological superiority that could not overcome determined resistance. It was a war that changed America forever, not through victory, but through the recognition that some conflicts cannot be won through force alone. Subscribe to Vietnam War Archives for more untold stories from America's most controversial conflict, and share in the comments below what you think the legacy of Ark Light operations means for modern warfare. What lessons should today's military leaders learn from the thunder that fell from empty skies?